So what went wrong? In the history of Judah, what was it that caused their eventual downfall? In the last session, we talked about all the different kings of Judah and some of the bad decisions that they made that eventually led them away into exile. But what precisely was the activity of the people? I mean, if that was just the kings, what did the people do that led them to this place in their history where they get taken away from their land? I mean, the exile is such a dramatic moment in the history of Israel. It changes the way the nation thinks about itself for the rest of history. So what was it that actually caused this downfall? What were the events or the choices that they made that resulted in this terrible place that they found themselves? In many ways, Jeremiah chapter 2 is an answer to that question. It details for us sort of all the different ways that Israel has turned their backs on Yahweh. Now, like the book of Jeremiah as a whole, Jeremiah chapter 2 is a bit of a chaotic jumble in order to convey this overwhelming point. Judah brought this on itself. Okay, you have all of these images and these metaphors that play throughout the whole chapter, but really all of them, as they get unpacked elsewhere in the book of Jeremiah, all of them find their root right here in chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2 really introduces us to all of these images, all of these metaphors that he'll continue to pull on as we move through the book, but they communicate the same point. Judah has done this to itself. And so, in many ways, the chapter in Jeremiah chapter 2 helps us understand different metaphors for how all of this unfolded. And so, Jeremiah chapter 2. The word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah says. Go and announce directly to Jerusalem that this is what the Lord says. I remember, God says, the loyalty of your youth. The word used there for loyalty is the Hebrew word chesed, which we have perhaps heard before. It's this word that means kindness or covenant loyalty, steadfast love, even some translations go with. And frequently this is used of God's feelings or God's attitudes towards his people. But here, it's used of the people of Israel and how they responded to God. I remember, God says, the chesed, the covenant loyalty of your youth. Now, if we've read the book of Exodus, surely we're a little bit confused, right? Are you talking about the point where they were at the Red Sea and we're like, turn back, why'd you bring us out into the wilderness to die? Are you talking about the point when Moses goes up on the mountain and the people build a golden calf? Are you talking about some of those points? I mean, to us, as we look at the early history of Israel, it does not seem that the people of Israel were overwhelmingly devoted to the Lord, right? Complaining about the manna, complaining about the water. But it seems that as God looks back on this period in history, there's a newness to their relationship. There was a devotion there, right? Exodus chapter 19, God shows up and essentially proposes marriage to the people. He says, I will be your God, you will be my people. If you want it, I'm offering to you myself. And the people say, everything you say, we will do. Now we know that they probably don't really mean it. But in this moment, man, there's a newness, there's a devotion there. There's this sweetness to their relationship. It's sort of like watching a wedding take place. We're all overwhelmed with the beauty of this love and so hopeful about the potential for this relationship. This seems like it's what God's talking about here in verse 2. Your love as a bride. I think that's the first metaphor we get. How you followed me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. Things were difficult there in the wilderness, where no travelers passed. It was difficult to live, and yet it forced them to depend on the Lord. Verse 3, Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. Like the firstborn, dedicated to Yahweh, of all of the animals that are born, of all of the people that are born, so Israel is supposed to be holy to the Lord. All who ate of it found themselves guilty, and disaster came on them. Evil came on them. Again, we can look back in Israel's history. We can think back to the story of the Amalekites who opposed Israel on their way out of Egypt. We can think of Sihon or Og, how they opposed Israel and God destroyed them. Indeed, all of these moments that they experienced along their journey, God stepped in and God protected his people. Anyone who tried to oppose them faced destruction. So, I think it's a little ironic that this is the best memory that God has. Like, this is it. Unfortunately, as the people enter into this relationship with God as his bride, the best we can do are some of these moments in the wilderness when they were forced to trust in the Lord and they faced opposition. I don't know, if I'm going to think about a honeymoon, it doesn't seem that moments where you faced battle would be some of the best moments. It's almost like you have a terrible honeymoon and then the marriage is 10 times worse. But that's sort of the story of Israel. And so, verse 4, hear the word of the Lord. In Hebrew, the word is shim'u. Sounds like Shema because it's just the plural form of that same word used in Deuteronomy chapter 6, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel. It's a command now to all of the people, the house of Jacob, all the families of the house of Israel. The problem will be they failed to Shema. They failed to listen or internalize the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. Verse 5, what fault did your ancestors find in me that they went so far from me, that they followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves? What fault, what injustice did your ancestors find in me? There is no injustice in God, is the truth, right? Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4 says, the rock, that is Yahweh, the rock, his work is perfect. All his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. A God without injustice is how he's described. And now God asked the people, so tell me, what injustice was there in me so that you didn't follow me? And so the people were following after these worthless idols. That's what the text says here. In Hebrew, it just says, so that they followed hevel, or breath, or vanity. This is the word used all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. That word for meaningless is actually this Hebrew word used here, hevel. It's translated as idols, but it doesn't really mean idols. It just means meaningless things, or breath, or vanity. It's actually a difficult word to translate because it doesn't really mean much of anything at all. The idea is that you're trying to grasp onto something and you just can't. It's sort of like smoke, right? It's there, and then when you try to grab it, it's gone. It's like a vapor. You try to get it and it's gone. And I think the idea is that it's just so frustrating. It's like trying to chase after the wind, Ecclesiastes says. And so as you try to chase after the wind, as you try to grab hold of it, you won't be able to do it. And it's just all so frustrating. Again, I think the message of Ecclesiastes is not so much that all of these different activities are meaningless. I think the message of Ecclesiastes is that they're just endlessly frustrating, right? The pursuit of them to find ultimate meaning in life is just going to leave you empty time and time and time and time and time and time again. And now Jeremiah looks at the people and says, you pursued after things that were empty. You pursued after things that were frustrating. And so what happens? You became that yourselves. In fact, that last line of verse 5 uses the verb form of that same word hevel that we just used. You pursued this thing, and therefore you became like it. You became what you worshipped. Verse 6, they stopped asking, where is the Lord who brought us from the land of Egypt, who led us through the wilderness, through the land of deserts and ravines, through a land of drought and darkness, a land where no one traveled through and where no one lived? In other words, where is the Lord? That's the question they should have been asking, but instead they just pursued their own way. Surviving at all through this land, it seems God is saying, was a miracle upon miracle. They received manna in the desert, right? When there was no food for them to eat, God literally caused bread to rain down from heaven that they just had to go out and collect every morning. And it was a sign to them that God was there with them. He was providing for all of their needs. God provided water for them in the wilderness. When they cried out to the Lord because they were thirsty and they didn't have anything to drink, God gave them water in the wilderness. Again, God gave them water at the rock, water coming forth so that they might be able to drink. On multiple occasions, God did this in the wilderness. And where were the people then? Where were they? Were they asking, where is the Lord? Where might we find the Lord? Where is this God who continues to give us manna, who continues to give us water in the wilderness? Where is he? No, instead, the people just seem to forget about God altogether. So God says, I brought you to a fertile land to eat its fruit and its bounty. But after you entered, you defiled my land. You made my inheritance detestable. In other words, the people have entered into the land, the promise of God, and yet the response to the abundance was rather destruction. In fact, I think verse 7 is maybe alluding to the story in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. To eat of its fruit and to eat of its good. We remember the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, or good and evil in the garden, right? And the choice of the people to actually eat of the fruit. So they took this good gift that God had given them and they chose to turn it into an abomination. What a transformation. They made God's inheritance, they turned into something that was absolutely detestable. Verse 8, the priests quit asking, where is the Lord? The experts in the law no longer knew me, and the rulers rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal, and they followed useless idols. The question always worth asking, I think, is where is the Lord in this? And the priests and the scribes and the shepherds and the prophets all failed to ask this question. It's like verse 5, right? But there they aren't pursuing after the idols per se. They're just going after things that don't profit. And so God says, I will bring a case against you. God is taking them to court because of what they've done. This is the Lord's declaration. I will bring a case against your children's children. Cross over to the coast of Cyprus and take a look. Send someone to Kehrer and consider carefully. See if there has ever been anything like this. God suggests that they go on a little regional tour here, just travel around and try to see, does anyone else do these things? Is any other nation like you, where you would try to go and get another god? Verse 11, has a nation ever exchanged its gods, but they were not gods? Yet my people have exchanged their glory for useless idols. You know, God swapping is just not a thing that's done in the ancient world at any time, anywhere. And the people here in Israel have done exactly that. The great irony, of course, is that God swapping, if it happened somewhere else, might make a little bit of sense, right? You swap one God who does nothing for another God who does nothing. Okay, what's the harm in that? But God's point is precisely that nobody else does this. People serve one God and then they stay with it. People serve this God who does nothing and they stay with it. But you, my people, Israel, you serve a God who actually does something, a God who is actually real, and then you want to trade me out for somebody else. So they have exchanged glory, the glory of the Almighty God, for something that does not profit. Be appalled at this, heavens. Be shocked and utterly desolated. This is the Lord's declaration. For my people have committed a double evil. There are twin evils at play here, both apostasy and attempted self-sufficiency. They have abandoned me. They've turned their backs on me, God says, the fountain of living water, but they've also dug cisterns for themselves, cracked cisterns that cannot hold water. They really thought that they could do it like a small child insistent on doing it himself. And yet the problem is they're not small children. They're grown men and grown women who have turned their backs in defiance on God, insist on digging their own cisterns that cannot hold water. Verse 14, is Israel a slave? Was he born into slavery? Why else has he become a prey? In many ways, this is a shift from the disastrous choices in verses 2 through 13 to now disastrous consequences in verses 14 to 19. And it's unlikely that these disasters have already come upon the people. Instead, it seems to me that the people are just are going to anticipate through the words of Jeremiah the destruction that is about to come their way. The young lions, verse 15, have roared at him. They have roared loudly. They have laid waste his land. His cities are in ruins without inhabitants. The men of Memphis and Tahpanhes also have broken your skull. Have you not brought this on yourself by abandoning the Lord your God while he was leading you along the way? I think all of these pictures and images of God leading the people and guiding the people and lions perhaps surrounding the people gives this image of livestock. It's another metaphor that God seems to be working with here. The people are in many ways like cattle. However, this livestock, these animals are headed down the wrong path, and they don't even realize the path that they're headed down. So, verse 18, now what will you gain by traveling along the way to Egypt to drink the water of the Nile? What will you gain by traveling on the way to Assyria to drink the water of the Euphrates? These are the two nations that Judah was prone to look for help in their direction, right? They could go up to Assyria at some point in their history. They could go down to Egypt at some point in their history, and yet trusting in these nations was never actually beneficial for them. Verse 19, your own evil will discipline you. Your own apostasies will reprimand you. Recognize how evil and bitter it is for you to abandon the Lord your God and to have no fear of me. This is the declaration of the Lord of armies. For long ago, God says, I broke your yoke. I tore off your chains, and yet you insisted, I will not serve. You see, the first image he gives here is of an ox. I broke your yoke. Again, working with this livestock metaphor. The response to this freedom, however, is defiance. And then, on every high hill and under every green tree, you lay down like a prostitute. Again, working this image of a bride. She was a committed woman, and yet she chose to give herself to other gods. Verse 21, I planted you a choice vine from the very best seed. How then could you turn into a degenerate foreign vine? It's another image. The vine dresser and farmer seems to be God, and yet he has this rebellious vine, this rebellious vineyard who seems to do whatever it wants to do. And so, verse 22, even if you wash with lye and use a great amount of bleach, the stain of your iniquity is still in front of me. This is the Lord's declaration. What a horrifying thought. As much as they scrub, they can't remove the stain. How can you protest? I am not defiled. I have not followed the Baals. Look at your behavior in the valley. Acknowledge what you have done. You're a swift young camel twisting and turning on her way. A wild donkey at home in the wilderness. She sniffs the wind in the heat of her desire. Who can control her passion? All who look for her will not become weary. They will find her in her mating season. Keep your feet from going bare and your throat from thirst, but you say, it's hopeless. I love strangers, and I will continue to follow them. This is pretty strong imagery here. Verse 26, like the shame of a thief when he is caught, so the house of Israel has been put to shame. But the difference between a thief caught and the house of Israel is that a thief actually recognizes that he's done something wrong, perhaps takes on the consequences of his choices and realizes that he takes responsibility. Not so with the people of Israel. Their kings, their officials, their priests, their prophets, they say to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave birth to me. They've turned their back to me and not their face. Yet in their time of disaster, they beg, rise up and save us. Oh, of course, now you want my help. But where are your gods you made for yourself? Verse 28, let them rise up and save you in your time of disaster if they can, for your gods are as numerous as your cities. O Judah, what a devastating word against the people. So verse 29, why do you bring a case against me? All of you have rebelled against me. This is the Lord's declaration. I have struck down your children in vain. They would not accept discipline. Your own sword has devoured your prophets like a ravaging lion. Evil generation. Pay attention to the word of the Lord. Have I been a wilderness to Israel, or a land of dense darkness? Why do my people claim, we will go where we want? We will no longer come to you. In many ways, this is the crucial message that they need to hear. They have turned against Yahweh, the one who loved them, who led them up as a groom, the one who led them in the wilderness like a good shepherd, the one who raised them up like a good farmer, like a good vine dresser. Instead, they've turned their backs on him. They've decided to go their own ways, to rebel against him. We will go where we want. We will no longer come to you, they cry out. Verse 32, can a young woman forget her jewelry or a bride her wedding sash? But my people forgot me for countless days. How skillfully you pursue love. You also teach evil women your ways. Moreover, your skirts are stained with the blood of the innocent poor. You did not catch them breaking and entering, but in spite of all these things, you claim, I'm innocent. His anger is sure to turn away from me. But I will certainly judge you because you have said, I have not sinned. Oh, how unstable you are, constantly changing your ways. You will be put to shame by Egypt, just as you were put to shame by Assyria. And moreover, and now we come to the climax of the chapter. Moreover, you will be led out from here with your hands on your head. Since the Lord has rejected those you trust, you will not succeed even with their help. I think this last verse is a picture of exile. The people are going to go into exile. Despite their noble beginnings and all the hopes that God had for the people, they've now turned their back on God. They have brought this on themselves. This chapter really is a sad profile of the spiritual history of Judah. I wonder if you were to take a spiritual history of your own life, what would your spiritual history or your spiritual profile look like? How would God describe the ways that he's worked in your life? How would he describe the ways that he's led you along? What metaphors would God use to describe his relationship with you and the ways that he's guided and directed and led you? I think the picture of Israel's history here is intended to move them back to Yahweh, to turn their hearts back to him. As they hear their own history, I think the message is, so turn now to the Lord and trust in him. So as you think about your own spiritual history, what is your reaction? Will you then choose to turn to the Lord, or will you turn your face away from him?